Recently, I met with a staff member from Florida Congresswoman Luna's office. I went there hoping to learn more about whether Congress members are aware of and taking advantage of the legislative negotiation and relationship building training that has specifically been designed for them by Harvard and others. The meeting itself went well. Sam was thoughtful, respectful, and generous with his time. But when I left, I found myself thinking about something completely different. At one point, our conversation touched on the way members of Congress often behave in public. The interruptions, the insults, the performative moments that seem designed more for social media clips than productive discussion. Sam wasn't especially troubled by it. In fact, he explained that much of it is performance for the cameras. Once the hearings are over, many of those same people get along just fine behind the scenes. And maybe that's true. What stayed with me wasn't that we saw it differently. People see things differently all the time. What stayed with me was realizing that something that still bothers me didn't seem to bother him very much at all. And that got me wondering, what happens when something becomes so familiar that we stop really seeing it? Because the more I've thought about it, the more I've wondered whether one of our greatest strengths as human beings might also have a hidden downside. We're incredibly good at adapting. Sometimes adaptation helps us grow, sometimes it helps us survive, and sometimes it helps us get used to things. And that's what I want to talk about today. I've replayed that conversation in my head several times since then. Not because Sam said anything wrong. He didn't. He was thoughtful, respectful, and genuinely trying to help me understand how things work from his perspective. What stayed with me was something much smaller. As we talked, I found myself leaning in. I kept asking questions because I was genuinely trying to understand how Sam saw it. The behavior in Congress bothered me, but it didn't seem to bother him in the same way. And I found myself wondering why. Was he seeing something I wasn't? Or had he simply been around it long enough that it no longer stood out to him? And the more I thought about that afterward, the more curious I became. We were looking at the same thing, the same hearings, the same interruptions, and the same public behavior. But somehow we weren't seeing it the same way. And that's when a different question started forming in my mind. Not who's right or who's wrong, but something much simpler. What happens when we're around something for so long that we stop noticing it the way we once did? Because the truth is, human beings are remarkably good at adapting, and most of the time, that's a gift. But I started wondering whether that gift might sometimes come with a hidden cost. Human beings are incredibly adaptable, and honestly, some of the best experiences of my life happened because of it. When I was 21 years old, I graduated from college and moved to Morocco, a predominantly Muslim country in North Africa, with my new Moroccan husband. One of my majors was international studies with an emphasis on the Middle East, and I was excited about the adventure ahead of me. But no amount of studying prepares you for actually living inside another culture. During my first few months there, I lived in a city called Azrou in the foothills of the Atlas Mountains. One evening, we were invited to someone's home for dinner. Traditionally, outside your close family, the men and women ate separately. And as a young American who had only recently arrived, that felt strange to me. I remember thinking, why should where I sit be determined by my gender? So I asked if I could sit with the men. To their credit, they graciously allowed it. I was the guest. But it was also obvious they weren't used to having a non-family woman sitting at the men's table. They were kind and welcoming, but I could tell they were a little uncomfortable. Looking back, one of the things I appreciate most is that they sat in that discomfort for my sake, not because they agreed with me, not because they wanted to change their traditions, but because they understood that I came from a different world. And over time, something interesting happened. The more questions I asked, the more people explained, not defensively, not angrily, just patiently. I remember one woman explaining why many Moroccans traditionally eat with their hands. She told me because it is our God-given spoon, fork, and knife. God was woven into everyday life in a way I had never experienced before. I still remember that conversation more than 3 decades later. Little by little, I began understanding not just what people did, but why they did it. And while many of my beliefs stayed exactly the same, my perspective expanded. I didn't become Moroccan. I didn't stop being American, but I understood people differently than I had before. And that's one of the gifts of adapting to a new environment. It doesn't always change what we believe. Sometimes it just changes what we're able to understand. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. That's one of our greatest strengths. But if we're not careful, adaptability can make us comfortable with things we've stopped examining. Truth check. That experience in Morocco taught me something important. The longer I lived there, the more I understood why people did things the way they did. Some things still felt different to me. Some things I never adopted myself. But understanding and agreement aren't the same thing. I didn't have to agree with everything to learn from it. And looking back, I think that's one of the gifts adaptation gave me. It helped me see things more clearly. But after my conversation with Sam, I found myself wondering about something else entirely. I kept thinking about the difference between understanding something and getting used to it, because those sound similar at first, but I don't think they're the same thing. When I moved to Morocco, I asked questions, I listened, people explained things to me. The more I learned, the more I understood. That's understanding. But getting used to something can happen without any of that. Sometimes we stop noticing something simply because it's been there for a long time, not because we've examined it or because we decided it's healthy, not because we've thought deeply about it at all. It's just become familiar, and familiarity has a way of blending into the background. I think most of us have experienced that somewhere in our lives. Maybe it's a family habit nobody really questions anymore, or a comment that gets repeated so often at work that people stop hearing it, or even something online that would have shocked us a few years ago but barely catches our attention now. The longer something stays in front of us, the less attention it demands. And that's what I've been wondering about. How do we know whether we're seeing something more clearly because we've come to understand it, or whether we're simply seeing it less because we've gotten used to it? Sometimes we think we've understood something when we've really just gotten used to it. Truth check. And maybe this is where adaptation becomes complicated, because adaptation isn't a flaw. Most of the time, it's one of the reasons we make it through difficult situations at all. Without it, every change could feel overwhelming and every setback would stay raw forever. Every new environment would feel impossible to navigate. But adaptation has a side effect I've been thinking about lately. Some of us have had the experience of moving near a train track. At first, every train feels impossible to ignore. You hear it, you notice it, sometimes it even wakes you up. Then a few months go by and something changes. The train isn't any quieter than it was before. You just don't pay attention to it anymore. And that's what I've been wondering about. How often does that happen with things beyond train tracks? Not because we've decided they're good or because we've carefully examined them, but because they've become part of the background. After a while, it barely catches our attention anymore. And sometimes that's perfectly fine. But sometimes it means we've stopped asking questions. And when that happens, familiarity can start masquerading as understanding. That's the part I can't quite shake. because something feeling normal and something being healthy aren't necessarily the same thing. I think I finally figured out what has been bothering me. Getting used to something doesn't automatically mean we approve of it. When I think back to Morocco, I adapted to a lot of things that were unfamiliar to me. Some of those experiences expanded my understanding. They helped me see people and traditions through a wider lens. But adapting didn't require me to stop thinking or stop asking questions. In many ways, the questions were the whole reason I learned so much in the first place. The more curious I became, the more people explained. And the more people explained, the more I understood. Not because I agreed with everything I encountered, but because curiosity kept me engaged long enough to see beyond my first reaction. That's why I don't think adaptation is the issue. In many ways, it's one of the reasons human beings are able to survive difficult situations and build meaningful lives in new environments. What concerns me is something slightly different. It's when familiarity quietly replaces curiosity, because curiosity is what keeps us paying attention. It's what keeps us asking questions and helps us tell the difference between understanding something and simply getting used to it. And maybe that's what I've been wrestling with ever since that conversation with Sam. Not whether he was right or I was right, just how do we make sure we're still looking closely? Because I suspect a lot of meaningful change begins long before people agree on what should happen. It begins when someone stays curious enough to take a second look. Something doesn't become healthy simply because it feels normal. Sometimes it just means we've stopped questioning it. Truth check. So through my window today, I still don't know whether Sam and I saw the situation the same way, and honestly, that's okay. The conversation ended, but the question stayed with me, not because I was trying to decide who was right, but because it made me wonder how often all of us confuse understanding something with simply getting used to it. The longer I've thought about it, the more I've come to appreciate that adaptation isn't the problem. Adaptation is one of the reasons we survive hard things, build new lives, and learn from people who see the world differently than we do. What matters is whether we stay awake while we're adapting, whether we keep paying attention and occasionally stop and ask ourselves, am I seeing this clearly, or have I just stopped noticing it? What's something you've seen become so normal that people barely notice it anymore? And when you think about it now, do you believe that's been a healthy change, an unhealthy one, or a little of both? I'd genuinely be interested to hear your thoughts. This week, pay attention to one thing that's become part of the background. Before deciding whether it's good or bad, pause and ask, when was the last time I really thought about this? Because sometimes the first step towards seeing clearly is simply looking again. This channel isn't about censoring or forcing people to agree. It's about slowing down long enough to really listen, understand different perspectives, and approach discussions with thoughtful reflection. Together, I welcome different views, I really do, but respect matters here. If you disagree, explain why. If you see it differently, share your perspective. Here, our differences are strengths, and they're starting points for deeper understanding, not weapons. And if you'd like a little extra help shaping your reply, I've linked my 3 Ps in Action comment edition in the description. It's the same process I use myself to pause, pinpoint truth, and proceed with purposeful forethought. The world changes. We change with it. The important part is making sure we're still paying attention along the way. If you find these reflections valuable, hitting the thumbs up, sharing this with a friend, or subscribing helps bring more people into the conversation. And I'm really glad you are here. Remember, pause, pinpoint truth, proceed with purposeful forethought. Join the conversation. See you next time.